The streets of Queens, New York, hummed with the familiar rhythm of city life on a warm summer evening in 2003. The neighborhood was changing, but its heart remained the same, a place where dreams either died or took flight. For Curtis 50 Cent Jackson, these streets held memories of both struggle and triumph. Cruising down the familiar blocks in his gleaming new Mercedes, 50 Cent couldn't help but reflect on his journey. The same corners where he once stood, trying to survive, now witnessed his transformation into a music industry giant. His latest album was blasting from car speakers all around the neighborhood, and young kids pointed excitedly whenever they spotted his car. The Mercedes itself was more than just a luxury vehicle. It represented everything he had fought for. Its pristine black paint reflected the street lights like mirrors, and the custom leather seats still had that new car smell he had dreamed about during his hardest days. The sound system, playing his own tracks at a modest volume, was worth more than what he used to make in months on these very streets. As he drove past his old building, he noticed a group of teenagers practicing their rap flows on the stoop. They reminded him of himself at that age, hungry, determined, and full of raw talent waiting to be shaped. He smiled, remembering how he used to write lyrics in his grandmother's kitchen, dreaming of the day his voice would be heard beyond these blocks. The neighborhood folks who were out that evening, the grocery store owner who used to give him credit when times were tough, the elderly lady who always said he'd make something of himself, the young hustlers who now looked up to him as proof that change was possible. They all waved or nodded in recognition. This wasn't just success. This was a community watching one of their own rewrite his story. Through his tinted windows, 50 observed how the area was slowly transforming. New businesses were opening up, some of which he had invested in, creating jobs for local people. The basketball court where he used to play had been renovated, partly thanks to his anonymous donations. He believed in lifting as he climbed, and every decision he made was about creating opportunities for others. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the streets that had shaped him. The air was thick with the scent of food from nearby restaurants, mixing with the lingering summer heat. Street vendors were packing up for the day, and families were heading home, creating that peaceful transition from day to night that he had always loved about his neighborhood. As he stopped at a red light, the bass from his speakers gently pulsing, 50 noticed how people still lived their lives here with that unmistakable New York resilience. Kids played on the sidewalks under their parents' watchful eyes, corner stores buzzed with activity, and somewhere in the distance, the subway rumbled, the heartbeat of the city he loved. Little did he know that this ordinary evening drive through his old neighborhood was about to turn into something extraordinary. A moment that would test his character and ultimately inspire millions. The peaceful cruise was about to be interrupted by flashing lights in his rearview mirror, setting the stage for an encounter that would prove that success isn't just about what you achieve, but how you carry yourself when faced with adversity. The red and blue lights flashed in 50 Cent's rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful evening like a knife. His heart didn't race. He'd been here before, but this time was different. He was different. As he carefully pulled his Mercedes to the curb, neighbors began to gather on their stoops, phones already out, watching the scene unfold. He took a deep breath and followed the routine he knew all too well. Hands visible on the steering wheel, music turned off, interior light switched on. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, taking slow, deliberate steps. The way the officer walked told its own story. There was something more than just a routine traffic stop in that stride. The tap on his window came with more force than necessary. 50 lowered it smoothly, keeping his movements calm and measured. The officer's flashlight beam swept across his face, lingering longer than it needed to. Recognition flickered in the officer's eyes, and his mouth curved into what could have been either a smirk or a grimace. Well, the officer said, dragging out each word. Looks like someone's doing pretty well for themselves. The tone carried years of assumptions and prejudices, wrapped in a thin veneer of professional authority. The gathered crowd grew larger, their whispers creating a soft backdrop to the tense scene. 50 handed over his license and registration before being asked, his movements smooth and practiced. The leather of his seat creaked as he reached for his glove compartment, making sure to announce his movements clearly. "Everything's in order, officer," he said, his voice steady and respectful. The officer took his time examining the documents, holding them up to his flashlight, even though the street lights provided plenty of illumination. "Expensive car for this neighborhood," he commented, his words heavy with implication. "Mind telling me how you afforded this?" The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger. Some people were recording on their phones, others were just watching intently, all of them sensing that this moment was about to become something significant. The air felt charged with tension, like the moments before a summer storm. Through the open window, 50 could hear kids asking their parents what was happening. He thought about them, about the example he was about to set. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every young person watching, learning how to handle themselves when faced with prejudice and power. "I'm a recording artist," 50 replied calmly, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby observers to hear. "I've been blessed with success, and I make sure to invest back in this community." He maintained eye contact with the officer, his demeanor respectful but unwavering. The officer's flashlight beam swept through the car's interior, lingering on the custom leather seats and state-of-the-art sound system. "Recording artist, huh?" he said, his tone making it clear he had more to say. "I seem to remember hearing about you before your music career." More phones were raised in the growing crowd. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene, and somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked. But no one in the crowd moved. They all knew they were witnessing something important. A moment that would either escalate into another sad statistic or become something entirely different. The tension hung in the air like thick smoke, but 50 remained composed. He'd faced far worse than this, and he knew that what happened next would depend entirely on how he chose to handle it. As the officer continued his theatrical inspection, 50 made a decision that would transform this encounter from a potential confrontation into something nobody present would ever forget. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. The crowd held their breath as 50 Cent slowly opened his car door. The leather seat creaked as he stood up, his movements deliberate and calm. The evening air felt heavy with tension, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the scene. "Hands where I can see them," the officer instructed, though 50's hands were already visible. "Stand over there, against the car." The metal felt cool against 50's palms as he assumed the position he knew too well from his past life. The expensive fabric of his jacket pressed against the Mercedes' pristine paint job. The officer began his search, making a show of it for the growing audience. Each pat-down was exaggerated, each pocket check more thorough than necessary. "You know," the officer said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I remember reading about you in our files. Used to be quite the businessman around here, weren't you?" Different kind of business, though. Someone in the crowd muttered, "This ain't right," but 50 remained silent, his face calm despite the public attempt to shame him. The officer continued his theatrical performance, checking areas he already searched, making comments about 50's past that were clearly meant to humiliate rather than serve any law enforcement purpose. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a whisper that carried in the evening quiet, "Why is he being mean to 50?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet profound, making several onlookers shift uncomfortably. The officer paused for just a moment, perhaps hearing the child's words, before continuing his search with renewed vigor. The memories flooded back as 50 stood there. Nights spent in similar positions, times when he had nothing but street dreams and determination. But now, something was different. He wasn't that same kid anymore. He'd survived 9 bullets, turned his life around, and built something real. Each album sold, each business deal closed, each job created in the community. These were his real victories. "You might wear expensive clothes now," the officer said, checking 50's wallet and making a show of examining each credit card. "But some of us remember what you used to be." He laid the cards out on the car hood one by one, as if conducting an investigation rather than a traffic stop for tinted windows. 50 watched his own reflection in the car's window, seeing not just himself, but the faces of everyone watching. Young kids with phones raised, recording everything. Elderly neighbors shaking their heads in disapproval of the officer's behavior. The same community that had witnessed his rise was now watching to see how he'd handle this moment of challenge. The search continued, becoming more about theater than law enforcement. The officer checked the car's registration again, ran the plates a second time, all while making subtle digs about 50's past. But with each attempted jab, 50's composure seemed to grow stronger, his dignity more apparent. Then came the moment that would change everything. As the officer held up 50's platinum credit card to the light, making another comment about sudden wealth, 50 made a decision. Instead of anger, instead of falling into the trap of confrontation, he chose a different path. His response would not only transform this encounter, but would become a lesson that would echo far beyond these Queen streets. Looking at his reflection one last time, 50 saw not just himself, but every kid from the hood who'd ever dreamed of making it out. Every person who'd been judged by their past rather than their present. Every success story waiting to happen. And in that moment, he knew exactly what he needed to do. As 50 Cent stood there against his Mercedes, his mind drifted back through the chapters of his life that had led to this moment. The gunshots that nearly took his life, leaving him with a changed voice and a second chance. The countless hours in the studio, turning his pain into poetry. The business deals that transformed him from a street hustler to a legitimate entrepreneur. His old house was just 3 blocks away, the same house where his grandma had raised him, where he'd written his first rhymes, where he promised himself he'd make it big one day. Now, standing here under the streetlights with an officer trying to tear down everything he'd built, those memories felt more powerful than ever. Through the crowd's murmurs, he heard the sound of children playing basketball at the nearby court, the same court where he used to practice his jump shot, dreaming of either making it in the NBA or becoming the next big rapper. Life had chosen the second path for him, but those dreams of rising above his circumstances had never changed. The officer was still talking, still trying to provoke a reaction. "I bet these people don't know the real you," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "I bet they just see the fancy car and the big chains. They don't know what you used to do right here on these streets." 50 felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The old him would have reacted differently, with anger, with defiance. But the bullets that had tried to take his life had also given him a gift. Perspective. He'd learned that true power wasn't about force or intimidation. It was about rising above, about showing a better way. He thought about all the young kids watching this scene unfold, recording it on their phones. What would they learn from this moment? Would they see another example of conflict between law enforcement and their community, or could this become something different? Something that might change minds and open hearts. The memory of his son flashed through his mind. He'd always tried to teach him that success wasn't just about making money. It was about maintaining your dignity, about lifting others as you climb. Now was the time to put those lessons into practice, to show that the streets had taught him more than just hustle. In his pocket, he could feel the business cards he carried everywhere. Cards for his record label, his clothing line, his vitamin water company. Each one represented a legitimate business that employed people from his community, gave opportunities to those who needed them most. These weren't just businesses. They were proof that change was possible. The officer's attempts to humiliate him seemed smaller now, less important in the grand scheme of things. 50 had survived being shot 9 times, had overcome poverty, had transformed himself from a cautionary tale into an inspiration. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was was just another opportunity to show that transformation was possible. He looked at the gathered crowd again, seeing hope mixed with anger in their eyes. Some were ready for confrontation, expecting it, maybe even wanting it. But 50 saw something bigger than just this moment. He saw a chance to teach a lesson about dignity, about rising above prejudice, about the power of maintaining your composure when others try to break you down. Taking a deep breath, 50 made his choice. The words he would speak next wouldn't just be for the officer or the watching crowd. They would be for every kid from the streets who needed to hear that their past didn't have to define their future. His response would show that true power isn't about domination, it's about transformation. "Officer," 50 said, his voice calm and clear in the evening air. "I understand you know about my past, but let me tell you about my present." The crowd leaned in, phone still recording, as 50's words carried across the quiet street. Even the officer paused, perhaps caught off guard by the unexpected tone of respect in 50's voice. "See that building over there?" 50 gestured toward a renovated storefront down the block. "I bought that last year, created 30 jobs for people from this neighborhood. People who might have gone down the same path I once did, but now they've got options." His voice wasn't confrontational, it was conversational, like he was sharing a story with an old friend. The officer's stance shifted slightly, his hand moving away from his belt. "That's great," he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't fully convinced. "But that doesn't change what you used to be." 50 smiled, not a mocking smile, but a genuine one. "You're right. I can't change my past, but I learned from it." He turned slightly, making sure both the officer and the crowd could hear him clearly. "Those 9 bullets that nearly killed me, they taught me something valuable. Life's too short to hold on to anger, too precious to waste on proving people wrong." A gentle breeze carried the scent of someone's cooking from a nearby apartment, reminding everyone that this was more than just a scene playing out. This was their community, their home. Every morning, 50 continued, "I wake up thinking about how I can help kids avoid the mistakes I made. That's why I started my youth program at the community center. That's why I invest in local businesses." He reached slowly into his pocket, making sure the officer could see his movements were non-threatening. He pulled out his phone and pulled up photos of recent community events he'd organized. "These are from last month's career fair. We brought in successful business owners, tech experts, and educators. Showed the kids there's more than one way to make it." The officer took a look at the photos, his professional mask slipping just a bit. In the images, kids from the neighborhood were sitting in workshops, learning about business, technology, and music production. "I didn't know about this," he admitted, his voice softer now. "Most people don't," 50 replied, "because it's not about publicity. It's about change. Real change." He gestured to the crowd watching them. "Everyone here knows what I used to be, but they also know what I am now, someone who came back to lift others up." A young kid in the crowd called out, "He helped my brother get into college." Others began chiming in with their own stories. How 50 had quietly helped families in need, funded local programs, created opportunities where none existed before. The officer looked around, seeing the community's response, hearing the genuine emotion in their voices. His attempts to humiliate had unexpectedly revealed something else entirely. A story of transformation and giving back that went far deeper than fancy cars or platinum records. 50 spoke again, his voice carrying a weight of experience and wisdom. "You saw my file, officer. You know where I started. But that's not the end of the story. Every day, I try to write a new page, not just for me, but for everyone watching. Because success isn't just about escaping the streets. It's about coming back to help others find their way too." The officer's demeanor began to change, like ice melting under the warm sun. He lowered his flashlight, and for the first time that evening, really looked at 50 Cent. Not as a case file or a stereotype, but as a person. The crowd watched in silence as something shifted in the atmosphere of this late evening encounter. You know, the officer said, his voice different now, softer around the edges. When I was coming up through the academy, they taught us to look for the bad, to expect the worst. He paused, looking around at the neighborhood, seeing it perhaps for the first time. Sometimes that makes us blind to the good. A kid's bicycle bell rang somewhere in the distance, and the sound seemed to break the tension further. 50 noticed how the officer's shoulders had relaxed, how his hand was now completely away from his belt. The crowd sensed it too. The energy was changing from confrontation to conversation. "Let me show you something else," 50 said, gesturing toward the community center down the street. Its lights were still on, even at this hour. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, we have music production classes there. But it's not just about music. We teach business skills, financial literacy, everything I'd wish someone had taught me when I was young." The officer took a few steps toward the center, genuinely curious now. "How many kids?" he asked. "Started with 10, 50 replied, pride evident in his voice. "Now we've got over 100. Some of them come from tough situations, just like I did. But in that studio, they're not troubled kids. They're future producers, entrepreneurs, business owners." A woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "My son is in that program," she said. "Used to get into trouble all the time. Now he's talking about college, about starting his own business. That's because of him," she pointed at 50. More voices joined in, each with a story to tell. The officer listened, his face showing surprise and then understanding as he heard about the quiet ways 50 had been changing lives in the community. The same neighborhood he'd been patrolling for years had stories he'd never known. "Last Christmas, an elderly man called out from his porch. When my heating broke down, someone paid to fix it. Didn't know it was him until months later." He nodded toward 50. Never wanted credit for it either. The officer turned back to 50, who was still standing calmly by his car. "Why didn't you tell me all this right away?" he asked. "When I first stopped you." 50 smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Because real change isn't about defending yourself. It's about showing through actions, not words. Everything I do here isn't for praise. It's because this community gave me my start, even when that start wasn't always in the right direction. Now it's my turn to give back." The streetlights seemed brighter somehow, casting a warm glow over the scene. The crowd had grown quieter, but their presence felt supportive now, not tense. Even the night air felt different, filled with possibility instead of confrontation. The officer looked down at the citation book in his hand, then back at the community center, its windows still glowing with promise. In this moment, he wasn't just seeing a traffic stop anymore. He was seeing a lesson about judgment, about change, and about the power of giving back. The officer closed his citation book and slipped it back into his pocket. The simple gesture spoke volumes to everyone watching. He took a deep breath, then extended his hand toward 50 Cent. "I think I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. 50 took his hand without hesitation, their handshake becoming a symbol of something larger than just two men making peace. "No apologies needed, officer," he replied. "Sometimes we all need to see things from a different angle." The crowd murmured in approval, their phones still recording what had become an unexpected moment of unity. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying away the last remnants of tension that had filled the air just moments before. "You know," the officer said, leaning slightly against 50's car, his body language now completely transformed. "I've been patrolling these streets for 12 years. Seen a lot of people talk about making changes, but not many actually do it." He gestured toward the community center. "What you're doing here, it's real." 50 nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Change isn't just about leaving the past behind," he said, his voice carrying to the attentive crowd. "It's about building a better future. Every kid in that center is a chance to break the cycle, to show there's another way." A young boy, maybe 10 years old, pushed through the crowd, clutching a worn notebook. "Mr. 50, he called out, his voice trembling with excitement. "Can I show you something?" The officer stepped aside, watching as 50 knelt down to the boy's level. The kid opened his notebook, revealing pages of carefully written business plans in childish handwriting. "I've been coming to your classes," he explained proudly. "I'd want to open my own store someday, just like you said we could." 50's face lit up as he flipped through the pages. "Look at this, officer," he called over his shoulder. "This is what real change looks like." The officer moved closer, genuinely interested, as 50 and the boy discussed the business plans. The crowd watched in amazement as the three of them, the rapper, the officer, and the young entrepreneur, huddled over the notebook under the streetlight. Other kids began approaching too, sharing their dreams and plans, turning what had started as a tense traffic stop into an impromptu mentoring session. "I never thought I'd say this," the officer admitted, watching the kids gather around. "But I think we need more people like you in this neighborhood. People who don't just succeed, but come back to show others the way." 50 stood up, placing a supportive hand on the young boy's shoulder. "That's the thing about success," he said. "It's not about how high you climb. It's about how many people you bring up with you." The officer pulled out his card and handed it to 50. "Next time you have an event at the center, give me a call. Maybe we can build some bridges between the department and these kids. Show them we're not all about citations and arrests." As they talked, more officers began arriving, responding to the crowd gathered on the street. But instead of tension, they found something unexpected. A community coming together, sharing stories of transformation and hope. The new officers joined the circle, listening to kids' dreams and plans, seeing their neighborhood through fresh eyes. Word spread quickly through social media. The videos captured by the crowd that night began circulating online, first through the neighborhood groups, then across the city, and finally hitting major social platforms. What people saw wasn't just another traffic stop. They witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of genuine transformation. The clips showed different angles of the scene: 50 Cent's calm demeanor, the officer's change of heart, the community coming together. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just what they saw, it was what they heard. The wisdom in 50's words, the sincerity in his voice, the way he turned a potential confrontation into a teaching moment. Local news stations picked up the story. "Hip-hop star turns traffic stop into community moment," read one headline. Another declared, "From confrontation to conversation. How one traffic stop changed minds." The story resonated because it was real, unscripted, and deeply human. The community center's phone started ringing nonstop. People wanted to know more about the programs 50 had mentioned. Business owners called offering internships for the kids. The police department reached out about starting a regular dialogue with the youth in the area. One video clip in particular went viral. The moment when 50 talked about success being not just about climbing high, but about bringing others up with you. People shared it with their own stories of overcoming prejudice, of proving others wrong through actions rather than words. The officer who made the initial stop became an unexpected advocate for community policing. In interviews, he spoke honestly about how his preconceptions had been challenged that night. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important lessons," he told reporters. "That night taught me to look beyond the surface, to see the person, not just the profile." Teachers started using the video in their classrooms to discuss conflict resolution. Youth workers shared it as an example of how to handle difficult situations with dignity. Police academies across the country requested copies to use in their training programs about community relations and bias awareness. The young boy with the business plan became a symbol of hope. His notebook, filled with dreams of entrepreneurship, represented all the young people who just needed someone to believe in them. Following that night, more kids started bringing their notebooks to the community center, each filled with their own plans and aspirations. Local businesses that had been skeptical about hiring people from the neighborhood began to change their minds. They saw how 50's investment in the community was creating real change, one person at a time. Job applications started flowing in, and help wanted signs appeared in windows that had been empty for years. But perhaps the most powerful impact was felt in the quiet moments that followed. When kids from the neighborhood walked past police officers, there were more smiles, more waves, more simple acknowledgments of shared humanity. The tension that had long existed began to dissolve, replaced by something that felt like understanding. The evening had started with an attempt to humiliate, but it ended by inspiring. It showed that real strength isn't about power or control. It's about the ability to rise above, to transform negative energy into positive change. 50 Cent had not only maintained his dignity, he'd lifted the dignity of an entire community. A year later, the intersection where that fateful traffic stop happened looked different. The community center had expanded, now occupying 3 buildings instead of 1. A new sign hung proudly outside. Dreams don't have deadlines. Words 50 Cent had spoken that night, now serving as inspiration for everyone who walked through its doors. The officer who made the stop that evening was now a regular presence at the center. Every Thursday, he taught a class combining business ethics with street smarts, helping kids understand both sides of the law. His badge had become a bridge rather than a barrier, and the kids looked up to him as much as they did to 50. The young boy with the business notebook. His little store was now a reality. A small shop selling school supplies and snacks right next to the community center. 50 had helped him set it up, teaching him about inventory, pricing, and customer service. Other kids worked there after school, learning the basics of business firsthand. Police training programs across the country had incorporated the incident into their curriculum. They didn't just show the videos, they brought in community leaders to speak, creating dialogue where there had once been division. The story had become more than just a viral moment, it was a blueprint for change. In interviews, 50 Cent rarely spoke about that night unless specifically asked. When he did, he always shifted the focus to the bigger picture. What happened that evening wasn't about me, he'd say. It was about showing that every moment is a choice. You can let negativity win, or you can transform it into something positive. The community center's programs had become a model for others across the country. Business leaders, educators, and law enforcement officials came to study how a simple traffic stop had sparked such meaningful change. They left with more than just ideas. They left with hope that similar transformations were possible in their own communities. Local graduation rates had improved. Crime rates had dropped. But more importantly, the atmosphere had changed. Kids walked taller, dreamed bigger, and believed more deeply in their own potential. They had living proof that your past doesn't have to define your future. The intersection itself had become something a landmark. People would stop by, taking photos of the spot where it all happened. But the real magic wasn't in the location. It was in the legacy that continued to grow. Every day, new stories of transformation emerged, each one adding to the ripple effect of that one evening. At community events, you'd often see 50 Cent and the officer standing together, sharing jokes and stories. Their unlikely friendship had become a powerful symbol of what's possible when people choose understanding over judgment, wisdom over confrontation. The final testament to the night's impact wasn't in the viral videos or news stories. It was in the quiet changes that lasted. In the way people treated each other with more respect. In the growing number of success stories coming out of the neighborhood. In the understanding that true power isn't about dominance. It's about transformation. That traffic stop had started as an attempt to humiliate, but it ended up illuminating a path forward. It showed that sometimes the most powerful response to negativity isn't fighting back. It's rising above and lighting the way for others to follow. And in doing so, 50 Cent hadn't just changed one moment, he'd helped change countless lives.